sort of thing.
Yeah.
You head down looking at your mouth breathing.
No, I was standing up, trying to go around them.
Nau mai, haere mai, ki te hui o te konahira o na roto o Rotorua. Morning everyone, it's a pleasure to see you all here, and it's a privilege for me to be sitting in this chair for the first time. So we are live streaming this meeting this morning, so welcome to all those out there in the world. Welcome to the media, Felix, and to the public that are here in the gallery. Just the usual reminders, turn off your mobile phones. We'll have a break later on in the morning and we'll have lunch. We've got a busy day ahead of us. I see that Councillor Wang is not here yet, so I wondered if someone... Apologies for lateness. So I wondered, could I ask if any other council would be prepared to step in to open the meeting with the karakia in place of Councillor Wang? Well, thank you, Madam Mayor.
I've never said the karakia. Tūtua mai I runga, tūtua mai I raro, tūtawa mai I roto, tūtawa mai I waho, kia tau ai, te Māori tū, te Māori ora, ki te katoa, haumie, huie, tāhiki e.
Kia ora. Thank you, Madam Mayor. Call for apologies. I do have one from Councillor Rotorua Tate, who is ill today, and I have an apology from Councillor Bentley for an early departure.
Yes, and through you, an apology for Ms. Marks. She's unavailable today.
Apology from Ms. Marks. So I ask that the apologies from Councillor Rotorua Tate be accepted. Is there a mover for that motion? Thank you, Mrs. Trumper. Seconded, Mr. Thomas. Those in favour? Aye, it's carried. Moving on now to declarations of interest. Are there any declarations of interest? I have one from Councillor Maxwell and one from Mr. Berry and Camp.
Yes, through you, I may have a potential conflict of interest in the confidential section, so I'll re-raise it then.
Thank you. Madam Mayor?
I should declare an interest. I chaired the prostitution law reform debate in Parliament, but we are only hearing submissions. So.
Thank you. Okay. No other declarations. Moving on now to urgent items that are not on the agenda, and it is urgent items, and this is the Strategy, Policy and Finance Committee meeting, so matters relating to that. Councillor McPherson.
Yes, thank you. Through you, Chair. Questions have been raised publicly by a statistician, I've got to stress, about the structural integrity of the Hemo sculpture. The analysis only used probability theory, and to reassure the public on health and safety implications, can an independent structural engineer please be engaged to evaluate the structural integrity of the sculpture? Thank you.
Councillor McPherson, it's not actually an urgent item. However, if I could just ask the Chief Executive to make a very brief comment, because we do have a really busy day ahead of us and we do have submissions later on this afternoon. So
through the Chair, if you'll permit me to just read a comment that from an email I received yesterday. And this is from a composite structural engineer who is overseeing the installation of the Hemo sculpture. He states, and I won't read it in full, that he has reviewed the structural integrity of the installation, and remembering that the installation is still underway at this stage, it is not complete. He says that there is no issue with the strength of the structure. Kilwell have installed some temporary security stays on his request as additional support whilst it has actually been installed.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll move on now to start the meeting. and ask for a mover and seconder for the motion that the minutes of the Strategy, Policy and Finance Committee meeting minutes of the 10th of September be confirmed as a true and correct record. Thank you, Mr. Berryman Camp. Seconded, Councillor Wang. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. We're moving now to the first of the staff reports on page 11. We're reviewing Class 4 gambling and board venue policy of 2017. I'd ask for a mover and a seconder to receive the report that the review of the Class 4 and board venue policy be received. Thank you, Mr. Thomas. Seconded, Councillor Yates. All those in favour, please say aye. Those against? Carried. Oh, thank you. Tēnā kōrua to Rosemary and Grant Hewitson, so I'll ask you now to overview the report.
Thank you very much, Morena. I'd like to introduce Dr. Grant Hewitson. Grant is quite an expert in this area, has helped a number of councils with their gambling policy work, so we engaged him to support us with the review. So I'll do a bit of an overall summary, but we'll both answer any questions. He's much more the technical expert than I am. So this has just been a regular 3-yearly review of this policy for Class 4 gambling and board venues. We've had a policy in place for a number of years. The last time we reviewed this 3 years ago, we did quite extensive community engagement and survey and so on, and we basically continued with a cap and a sinking lid. That's been reasonably effective in that time. Part of the review, we're required to look at the social impact of gambling. That's required of us to look at that. So there's been a small reduction with our policy in the last 3 years, but like many places around the country, it's sort of tailed off, and the ability of the policy to have a reduction effect has limitations. There's some different things that we can do. One is adopting a sinking lid without a cap. One is reducing the cap further. However, we haven't actually reached the cap at this point. We could not allow any relocations. That's something with the submissions last time that we looked into in some detail and came to a decision around what was a reasonable relocations. Or we can maintain the status quo, which is largely what we're recommending this time. Some of the things we discovered through the review, and particularly around some case law around the sale and supply of alcohol. And as a result of that, there are implications for places that sell alcohol and have a gaming licence, and that the alcohol is meant to be their main business, not the gaming, and that's something we think should be looked at over a period of time for the places in Rotorua, just to make sure that they are compliant. We also really noticed that previously submissions were quite strongly that some of the benefits of gambling to our community was the return of some of those proceeds. Legally, that has to be 40% of the proceeds have to be returned to communities. It doesn't specify what communities. So, in fact, what we've discovered is that we're getting about 22% back directly into the Rotorua district. So we think we'd like to obviously see more of that coming back, much closer to the 40%. I think, as it says there, of the 7.54 million redistributed grants, only 4.7 million of that came back to Rotorua. So there's room for improvement there. And I think that at this stage, we're thinking that, given the controls that Internal Affairs has, as well as ourselves, is that the policy is still working effectively at the moment. We do think, however, though, that needs a 6-monthly follow-up with DIA, just checking on what's happening with the relocations and movements. And if at the point we're getting closer to our cap, then that will be a time to instigate another review and consider making changes at that point. At the moment, the changes that we've made in the pack today are really just updating the new legislation. It doesn't actually make any effective changes to how the policy operates. And at this stage, we're thinking that's the right thing that we'd be recommending today. So, so if there's any questions or clarifications. Yeah.
Questions, Your Worship?
Oh, not really. I'm happy with the recommendation, and we are beneficiaries of the return. I'm surprised it's only 22% actually, because we see such a lot coming into the community. But the link in point 5 with the alcohol, isn't that something that we do as part of our business anyway? I was interested to hear you say we ought to look at that. Are we letting that down a bit?
Through you, Madam Chair. The case law on this at the Alcohol Regulatory Licensing Authority level has changed recently. So my understanding is that most councils have observed that generally over the in the past. But the Roscoe case, which was actually taken by the alcohol inspector in Tauranga, resulted in a decision at DLC and then an appeal to the regulatory authority. And they very clearly decided in that case that where a tavern is seeking to renew its licence, then there's two tests. The first is what they described as an eligibility test, where the tavern must demonstrate that its primary activity is the sale of alcohol and other refreshments. And if it has a Class 4 venue licence or gambling, then it cannot be that its primary purpose is gambling. In that case, that premise was a kind of narrow premise, not a large tavern. The bar was to one side. There were, I think, 18 machines, predominantly down the rear of the premise. Certainly, the customers tended to go there for gambling. The revenue streams indicated that gambling was a primary activity on the premise. DIA has that data and was able to share it with the DLC. There was a lot of signage demonstrating that gambling and gaming was a predominant activity on the site. So it was that kind of premise that just struck that particular alcohol inspector as not fitting what it should. And so he challenged their right to hold a tavern licence when his view was that it was primarily gambling. So the recommendation really rests off that case and in a sense has become a legal obligation on your district licensing committee. But one thing that other councils have been doing, particularly in Auckland, is doing an assessment across all of their tavern licences where there's Class 4 gaming, and the alcohol inspectorate have been kind of making an assessment about which of those might not fit the category, and they'll be, in Auckland and in a number of other places around the country, they're starting to challenge those on renewal. So we're simply saying, in this recommendation, it's become a legal obligation. It's something the council should be looking at, slowly and carefully doing over the next, say, 3 years.
Mr. Berryman-Kemp.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for your report, and it's good to go through this. But my question is fundamentally, how can we enforce the intent of the policy? And I guess where I'm heading from, to provide some context with that, from my reading of the report, the policy is not working because we have a reduction in cap, but we haven't achieved that. And looking at it, we're not actually close to achieving it. And I know one of the recommendations was reducing the cap from 350 to 320, but if we're not even able to get relatively close to 350, the question it raises to me is how do we actually enforce the intent of the policy in much the same way as the 40% distribution? I get a sense in the report, and I'm not quite familiar with this, that it's rather dependent on these entities deciding to do that. Whereas I think that the intent of the policy is to actually meet those. So, and in particular with the 40% distribution that should be made, given Māori are overrepresented in terms of harm, one would think that that funding could then be apportioned to Māori providers of gambling support services. So I guess my question is, how can we enforce the intent of the policy? Because right now it doesn't seem to be achieving the intended cap. And my second part with that is that in terms of review of recommendation number 3, I think that the policy should be reviewed.
Again, through you, Madam Chair. One of the difficulties with these policies is that the statutory framework that sets them up doesn't actually provide sufficient levers for local authorities to have a rapid decrease in venues and gambling machines. The levers are relatively restricted. So your real choices, as we've set out in the report, are to have a complete sinking lid and no cap, to have a no relocations policy at all, kind of the strictest parts of the framework that's provided by the statute that you can take. But the difficulty that you've pointed out, and it is a difficulty that Rotorua has, along with a number of other councils, but probably to some extent you're lagging a little bit behind where even the national averages are going, is that it then is really a choice of the societies and venue operators about whether they stop offering gambling or gaming in their premises. So even though you might have the strongest policy, really the only instruments about reductions come back to whether those societies and those operators want to do that. And they don't, look, in terms of the revenues they get, they're generally happy with the situation they've got. And you only get reductions in machines when a business may go completely out of business or there's some other difficulty or issue that arises with that business. So you're doing almost as much as you can with your policy, but it's not really having the desired effect that the community, I suppose, or one part of the community wants, which is a reduction in the number of venues and gaming machines. So in terms of the review, our assessment was you could do a little bit more in terms of your policy. You could have a complete sinking lid, but actually at the moment you've got a sinking lid, but you've got a cap on that, and the cap is well below where your current machines are. So there's no, because you went out for consultation 3 years ago, we felt, particularly in the current climate, that going back out to consultation and really revisiting all of that would simply take you back to the position you're largely in at the moment. In terms of relocations, while you allow relocations, you're very strict, and the last review became very strict on where those relocations could occur, particularly in relation to sensitive sites such as education facilities and so on. So again, while you allow relocations, you're really only allowing those within the CBD, and you're very restrictive about where those relocations can occur. So you're doing as much as you probably can in that space as well. So it came back to overall, what were the things that you could do to perhaps improve outcomes in the district? And we recommended that the policy would essentially stay the same because it's doing pretty much everything it can do. Avoid going to consultation, but focus on these other things that I think may result in a better outcome for the district. And that kind of leads to your second question, which is, at the moment, the requirement for 40% of the proceeds to be returned is being met, but only 22% of those proceeds are coming back to Rotorua District. And I think a frank conversation could be had with the societies about why is that. This is our report writers did this analysis. The analysis that we did is based on information that's second-hand. It's information that's obtained by the Problem Gambling Foundation about what they've obtained from the websites of the societies. So there is actually a more clear route to understanding that, which is essentially to ask each of the societies, well, this is the information we have. What is the return that you're providing to Rotorua? This is what our report writers came up with, but let's be clear, are we on the same page about that? And then if they accept that the data that's provided in the report is largely accurate, then I think a frank conversation about, well, we want more of those proceeds to be returned to Rotorua, and we want more of those proceeds to be returned to those communities that are actively gambling on the machines, Māori or Pacifica communities or other communities. We want to make sure that the problem gambling support is the best it can be in Rotorua, and therefore we want to see those funds move through into those sorts of support structures. I think that your council is in a good position to sit down with these societies and ask those hard questions of them and say, look, we're not going to make any changes to the policy, but we want to see some clear progress on that before our next review in 3 years, because if we don't see progress, we might have to reconsider and use the strongest levers that are available under our policy. The other thing that I think has been successful in Tauranga as an example, Auckland and others, is taking the approach of you're required to demonstrate that your activity is primarily a tavern in the sale of alcohol and refreshments and not gambling, has meant that a number of premises where that is not the case have closed. And those machines and those premises have then essentially stopped in that area or in that district. So we've had examples of that in Auckland, and we've had that Roscoe case in Tauranga. So again, taking an approach of reviewing that and perhaps challenging those premises that are not demonstrating they're primarily a tavern is another opportunity to reduce the number of venues and machines in your district in line with the kind of key policy points of your policy. So, sorry, that's probably a rather long-winded answer to your question, but essentially it's the policy's doing probably as much as it can. Having a frank conversation with societies about returning more of the proceeds to Rotorua is something that's been recommended, and then complying to a large extent with the Roscoe decision and reviewing whether taverns are legitimately taverns is also something that I think will make a shift and change in terms of what the community is wanting in terms of overall outcomes for Class 4 gambling. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Well, thank you for that. I think it's good just for us to know what the levers are or the carrots and sticks that we have within the current policy. Councillor Bentley?
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. My question has sort of already been answered in that I was going to ask how we can get a better share than 22%, but you've covered that with Mr. Berriman-Camp's question. Thank you.
Councillor Kumar?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, I'd just like to let you know that on bullet point 6, which I probably missed, it says that a request is being made to Department of Internal Affairs on data for number of lottery shops and other as to how much gambling money grants go out. Just wanted to inform the chair that I have a lotto shop, so I wonder if that is a conflict of interest or not.
I think it's for you to declare the conflict of interest if you believe that you yourself have a conflict of interest. It's not for me to rule on that.
Madam Chair, if I may, so the recommendation is to obtain the data from DIA. So, look, in terms, I don't want to offer any advice about whether you have a conflict of interest or not, but it's not from the store itself. It's data from the Department of Internal Affairs. And the reason for that is that when you look at the gambling statistics, lottery outlets and lottery products are becoming an increasing part of the equation in terms of gambling. But we have local authorities and communities have very little information about where the lotto outlets are, where they're are they have the national average in their community, or they have more than the national average. And so the recommendation is, again, to find out more information about that, to really inform your community about where they stand on those sorts of products generally going forward. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair, and thank you very much, Doctor. My supplementary question is, having seen in the last 3 years that the numbers are still the same and there's no been increases, but no major decrease as well. So my question is that if we are going to see as what has happened in Tauranga with regards to the taverns, in Rotorua, for example, it's already been a tough year with COVID for a lot of taverns and stuff, and they need that income. But I'm just wondering if it is that the gambling portion of that, more than where the taverns other products are, whether it be beverages, food, is because of after hours, people that just go and do gambling, maybe from 10 o'clock onwards to when it's open till 2 o'clock, there'd be more gambling than the actual sales of food and beverages. Because a lot of people would have probably retired from wanting to have food and drinking at that time and then. So would a reduced hours be in this capacity be able to be controlled, or would?
In some respects, the people who own tavern licenses and Class 4 venue licenses should be aware of this decision. It's a reasonably significant decision, and I'm sure news of it has travelled through the industry, if you like. So it's really incumbent upon the venues or owners who have tavern licenses and Class 4 venue licenses to manage their business in a way where the gambling portion of it does not become the primary activity. And it's a statutory requirement. So it's not something you can kind of go, well, there's some discretion around that. It's what the statute says. So the Sale and Supply of Alcohol Act is very clear, and this decision makes it even more clear that your primary activity, if you hold a tavern license, must be the provision of alcohol and other refreshments. That's your primary activity. The Gambling Act says that your primary activity, if you operate a Class 4 venue, cannot be gambling. It has to be something else. And generally that's why Class 4 venues and taverns go together, because the two acts sort of support each other, and a tavern license says, well, my primary activity is a tavern and I'm selling alcohol and other refreshments. That's my primary activity. So if it's the case that during the course of your hours of holding your tavern license from midday to 12 midnight, it happens that a lot of people attend at certain parts of the day to gamble as opposed to drink alcohol and have some food, then you have to manage that carefully so that you're not, at the end of the day, resulting in your tavern being primarily gambling. So I think I would probably suggest it's not the case for the council to determine what hours might be reasonable or unreasonable. It comes back to the tavern operator operating their tavern, so their primary activity is alcohol, the sale of alcohol and other refreshments. But the Roscoe decision does place an obligation on your district licensing committee to test that when an application for renewal of a tavern license comes before them. And they have quite a lot of powers available to require information and so forth about that.
Thank you for that. Councillor Donaldson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Through you. Look, I'd just like to indicate that I'm happy to move 2 through 6, but I do have a question. And we had a really good workshop on this topic, and at that we sort of recognised that, like everything, every activity has been affected by COVID, and we're currently in that environment. So part of my question, or my first question, is during lockdown, when these premises were closed, did we see a pivot to gambling online and through Lotto online? That's my first question. And my other one is just in terms of the issue raised by Mr. Berriman Camp about the intent of the existing bylaw, which I support retaining in the current environment. If we look at the report on page 14, the machines that are sort of a bit in limbo are all in the CBD, which is, if anywhere, is where we want this activity to take place or to be focused. We're currently working towards a CBD plan, and we're some way off getting that established. But in terms of wielding a stick to enforce the existing policy, surely it sits largely with DIA, who can, for example, let inactive machines stay inactive ad infinitum. And I just wonder if you could comment on the pivot during lockdown to online forms of gambling, and also examples of how those machines can stay inactive for however.
So, yeah, the statistics that have come through from the Department of Internal Affairs in terms of the gambling statistics clearly show that because of lockdown, Class 4 gambling poker machines were inactive as well. So there's been a significant decrease in the amount of gambling that's taken place on poker Class 4 gambling machines this year as opposed to last year. And we've got some graphs that kind of clearly show that. The statistics do indicate that there was an increase in particularly sales of lottery products and online lottery products during lockdown as well. So we're not sure if there's been a transfer. It just may be the case that people who weren't gambling have become more interested in gambling because that's what lockdown offered. So we don't know why that's occurred. We know clearly why the decrease in poker revenue occurred, because they were all locked down and you couldn't access them. But we're not quite clear if those people have now transferred over and were using lottery products and other online gambling, or that's just the general population. But probably there'll be some research and analysis come through that in the next while. I think that answers your question on the pivot.
I think where I'm coming from is if people want to gamble as an activity, they'll find a way.
Yes, but there are differences in the way that gambling and its addictiveness operate. So one of the real risks around poker Class 4 machines is their addictiveness, because you get an instant gratification from them, and because of the way they're designed and the colours and lights and everything else that goes with them. Whereas lottery products, particularly if you're buying a ticket and you have to wait a number of days or even hours before you get the result from that distance means that it's less addictive to you than poker machines. So there are quite differences about the way in which gambling operates. Online gambling, that's accessible from overseas sites, that's largely mirroring the kinds of addictiveness that poker machines have. Is recognised as quite a risk, and the government has been working on how to address that issue. But a lot of things with the kind of internet and the modern world and modern access to technology, closing one door can open another. So they're taking their time to work out how to do that. But certainly within New Zealand, the regulation of who can offer online products is reasonably restrictive. It's just that you can access right now, if you like, an overseas gambling outfit on the internet. So we're trying to, as a country, work out how to resolve that, would be the kind of answer to that. Sorry, and then...
Was the machines in limbo and inactive?
Yeah, inactive.
Extended?
So one of the issues that arose through the review was the VC Turf Bar site. Has 18 machines on it, but has been redeveloped. And what the Lion Foundation, who are the society that owns those machines, rather than electing to remove them and have those removed from the district, applied for them to be inactive. And there's a process under the Gambling Act, under Section 71, that allows machines to be inactive. There's a bit of doubt in my mind about whether you're that was intended for them to be inactive almost permanently. I have some doubt that that's the intent of that section. But the way the Department of Internal Affairs currently approaches it is that they have allowed a 6-month inactivity for those machines, and they're granted a further extension of that for another 6 months. And it's probably the case that they will do that at some point again. The question for a council, I think, in that situation, or local authority or yourselves, is perhaps to indicate that that is not really appropriately meeting the intent of your policy, that your policy is designed to bring down the number of machines over time, and that it's not satisfactory for inactive machines to simply remain inactive and then come back to life at some point in the future. So our sense at this stage is that you can obtain that information by requesting it from the Department of Internal Affairs under Section 103, and there's a recommendation to do that every 6 months. So our sense is perhaps to let that remain the case with the inactive machines for another 6 months, request a Section 103 report, and if it remains the case that those are inactive or they've granted a further extension, it may be at that stage that the Council does wish to sit down with DIA and express some concern that this inactivity seems to be creating a sort of permanent situation when you have other plans for those sites within your CBD, and you need to be clearer about whether these machines are going to come back to that site or whether the site can more appropriately be used for something else. So I don't think there's anything preventing you. You may want to do that sooner, but there's nothing preventing a council saying we're concerned that the inactive granting of this licence is causing us some issues about how we manage our CBD and manage our sites going forward in the future.
Thank you for that. Would that be a suggestion that we recommend as well, that Council follow that up with DIA as part of number 6? To just give it a bit more meat in terms of the requirement to deal with those inactive machines?
It's to some extent kind of covered under 4. So the idea under 4 was, at this stage there's only been 2 extensions, or one grant and then a further 6-month extension. Our sense was perhaps just to see if that is rolled over again, you'll find out through a Section 103 report within 6 months, and then we can bring perhaps a report back to the committee suggesting perhaps that is an appropriate time to ask some hard questions of DIA, or alternatively, you're welcome to make it adjust that slightly here and request that a discussion with DIA take place more quickly than that. But Rosemary, you may have a view on whether it's appropriate to leave things or whether we want to bring that discussion with DIA up more quickly.
If I could, Madam Chair, my original question was what precedents are there for this extension? And that I guess the comparison was made in the workshop of the Christchurch rebuild and how many sites in Christchurch were rolled over while. So we don't have our CBD plan finalised yet. That site is up for redevelopment. It's been stalled through COVID. And so I think we need to sort of not, have the discussions, but not come down hard until we've got a plan on where we're going with our CBD. So I was really interested in how long Internal Affairs had rolled things over in Christchurch while they tried to get their CBD back up and running.
So the examples in Christchurch have been that the inactive licences have been rolled over for almost a decade. So at the time of the earthquake, there were sites that were damaged so that the machines couldn't operate, and DIA essentially allowed an inactive grant to occur in an ongoing way. And we haven't entirely, I suppose, have a view of whether that's occurred with all the sites in Christchurch, but certainly there was a bar recently that re-established after I think about a 10-year period, and 80 machines were essentially re-established on that site because it had this inactive licence over that long period of time. And of course the local community there, who were not aware that that was going to take place, were relatively upset that suddenly this bar, and it was in a neighbourhood area, reappeared with 18 gambling machines. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Mr. Thomas.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I don't actually have any questions. I do have some comments. I don't know if it's appropriate to give them now or if we want to
We'll
finish
just finish
questions.
the questions, I think, first. Are there any other questions? Councillor Bentley?
I'd move 236. Oh, sorry, second 236.
Are there any other questions? And before I take comments? No, Mr. Thomas, then your comment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I've got a few comments here, but I did just first just want to make a comment about the DLC, the tavern licences and stuff like that. And I attended a DLC webinar last week, and actually a lot of time was put into that specific issue of when you're looking at the renewal of tavern licences, looking at whether they have a gambling licence as well, and looking at that issue of them needing to be making their money out of the drink and other refreshments, not the gambling. So I think the whole DLC network New Zealand-wide is becoming more and more aware of that. So that was just a little bit of information to give back to people. My comments around this, I think my first comment is that I think it is alarming to see how disproportionately we're represented in Rotorua in all the gambling, pokey gambling statistics in terms of the number of machines we have compared to the national average, in terms of the money spent compared to the national average. So I think we do need to be looking at this issue very thoroughly. And I am disappointed that there isn't a recommendation to have submissions. When we had the review in 2017, when we got a lot of extremely high quality submissions from experts in the field, from all sides of the fence, from the trusts, from the gambling harm reduction people, from the sports that benefit from the grants, from the machines. It was a really worthwhile series of submissions that we had. And I note that we have 5 new members on SPNF since then who didn't have that opportunity of that previous review. And I think it would have been good for them to be able to get that information from those experts directly. My next comment is just around, at the moment we have the sinking lid policy to 350, and it obviously hasn't been working. And in fact, our original sinking lid policy of 380 hasn't worked. We haven't actually got down to that level. And from my perspective, looking at and reading through the information and from the workshop, the issue is that we allow relocations. So when one shop closes up, they move their licences to another venue, and that's why we're not getting the sinking lid policy. And I note that our policy has a maximum of 9 machines per venue. However, when you look through a list of where all the machines are, and I know it's existing rights, but lots of them are 18, 15, well over that 9. And we have an example in the report today of a venue wanting to relocate their licences, and they will move 18 licences in effect. Yes, we will lose 9 out of the 27 combined, but we will end up with a venue in a very main area of town with 18 machines. So, that's kind of going against our policy already. So I just wanted to make that comment that we may be, and this is the relocations policy, allowing that to happen. So I find that a bit concerning. Councillor Donaldson has already mentioned our plans or proposals around the CBD and redevelopment and introducing more accommodation in there. And once again, I think is suddenly that puts a different light onto the number of machines we're allowing in the CBD. So the purpose of having them in the CBD was to pull them out of the suburbs, out of the accommodation areas. If we're now allowing them to accumulate in the CBD when we're wanting to bring people in to live there, maybe that's not appropriate anymore, and that is another aspect we need to be looking at. I guess my last point is that personally, I find the fact that only 22% of the proceeds come back into our community is disgusting. We should be seeing a lot more of that money coming back in here. and the trusts that have the machines in Rotorua should be paying as much of that money back into the Rotorua district as possible, because the statistics are showing us that gambling and pokie machines are causing undue harm in our community, and we need to be working towards using those proceeds to try and reduce that harm. So those are my comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Thomas. Are there no other comments? Councillor Donaldson?
Thank you. I made most of my points, Madam Chair, but I do absolutely agree with Mr. Thomas that the issue of the return of 22% of the 40% that comes back to the community that is paid into these machines by this community coming back is unacceptable, and that whatever advocacy we can bring to addressing that, the sooner the better, because as has been stated, and I won't go on about it, but we do have significant negative social indicators in this community that should be being addressed by that 40% return from this activity. Otherwise, I support.
Thank you. There being no other comments or questions on this, we've had the motions 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6, and I'm going to take them as read. Have been moved by Councillor Donaldson. They've been seconded by Councillor Bentley. I'm going to put that to the vote. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Thank you, Mr. Thomas. It's carried. Thank you, Rosemary and Grant. My apologies to Councillor Maxwell. I should have noted for the record that he had declared a conflict of interest in this item and that he did not take part in the discussion or the voting on that and had removed himself from the table. We're now going to move on to the open space policy. So I ask for a mover and a seconder for the motion that the report adoption of draft open space level of service policy for public consultation be received. Thank you, Councillor Yates. Seconded, Councillor Donaldson. All those in favour, please say aye. It's carried. I've got Stephanie and Rob to overview this report. Over to you.
Tēnā koutou Council, and through you, Madam Chair, thank you for the opportunity to bring this draft policy to you. Some of you may recall that we discussed this policy earlier in the year at a council workshop. The intention of having this policy up and running is that it's going to give us great open spaces for our community, and great open spaces in turn create a whole lot of wellness values and also basically contribute significantly to thriving communities. So I've got Steph Kelly with me today, who's our recreation planner. She'll be going through this presentation and then we'll take any questions that we can. Thank you.
Morena councillors, and through you, Madam Chair. I'm just going to run through a few slides that essentially go over the content of the policy and reflect what's in the report in your agenda. Oh, that way. So the purpose of this policy really is to outline Council's approach to the provision and development of our open space network. That includes informing open space provision requirements in new growth areas and also giving us a framework to assess our existing open space to make sure that it is fit for purpose and providing great open space value for our community. It will guide any decisions around open space acquisition and divestment, and also ensure that we've got an integrated approach across the organisation, particularly with stormwater, site cleaning and other activities that our council provides. It also has strong alignment with the Housing and Thriving Communities strategy, particularly around that Thriving Communities component of that, ensuring that our communities have access to great open space. Oh, wrong way. So the proposed policy contains a number of objectives that we're trying to achieve from our network, ensuring that our network is accessible to everyone, that it's well connected, that it's protected and that we're able to develop it in the way that it should be developed. It's something that our community is proud of and that we are providing our open space network in partnership with Te Arawa and our community. The level of service, there's 4 levels of service standards contained in the policy. So quality, essentially what our open space network looks and feels like. Quantity, how much open space we have. And really the quantity measure is used to benchmark us against other councils in terms of how many hectares of open space we have per 1,000 people. Accessibility, so ensuring that all of our community has access to open space. So the minimum level of service requirement in terms of accessibility is that 95% of our community within the urban area can access a reserve within 500 metres of their home. And function, that reflects what's the purpose of those reserves. So we have a range of different types of reserves, all the way from premier spaces through to local pocket parks, which you'd probably see within the urban area, or within the city centre. So we just wanted to give you a couple of examples of what a good reserve looks like and what a bad reserve looks like, essentially, so that you can kind of get a feel for where we're trying to head. So this is Hodgkins Street Reserve. It's obviously on Hodgkins Street. It's very big and probably bigger than we'd ever require now. So our policy proposes that a good open space is around 3,000 square metres. So this is bigger than what we'd probably ever get these days. It's got excellent road frontage, visibility, it makes it safe, and it provides those really good amenity values for the neighbourhood, the residents living around there. It's flat, so it can be used for a range of things for our community. This one happens to have a playground on it. It's central to the community and it's really, really accessible for the people that live around there. It's got a couple of access ways, as well as that excellent road frontage. In comparison, this is a little reserve that you probably doesn't know exists, and neither does the rest of Rotorua, to be honest. It's really small, so it's about the size of a normal residential section. It has no road frontage. It has a really poor access. Most of the reserve is steep and can't be used for anything. And it's in a really, really poor location. So while there is a 500 metre catchment around it, the majority of residential properties can't access it or use it, for that matter. So this is what we're trying to avoid, particularly when we're going to see new growth. So in those new growth areas, we want to make sure that our open space provision that we're getting in those areas is really good quality. So how are we going to implement this? The policy would inform our locality and structural planning processes that we're currently undertaking. It would enable us to develop some open space network plans. So that's essentially taking the policy and overlaying it over our existing network to identify how much alignment we have from our existing network. It will enable developers to inform their scheme plans as they're starting to develop those. It'll form the basis for collection and use of our financial contributions, which are the provisions in our district plan. We've talked about the alignment with the existing network. It'll inform our LTP capital program for open space. So where do we need to invest into our open space network to bring it up to standard? And it will ensure that the other activities that our council undertake can do that in an easier way. So informing stormwater network planning, walking and cycling strategies, etc. So what we're seeking from you today is a recommendation to council that we take the policy out for consultation pursuant to section 82 of the Local Government Act.
Thank you, Steph. So happy to take any questions.
Questions? No questions? Mr. Thomas.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Look, just a quick question. I think it's a great review and look forward to you taking that to the community. My question is just around, you'll kind of expect it, around lakeside areas where there's very limited ability to actually for council to own land. And we have the example with our playgrounds out there that you're often having to put them on iwi land. And so I'm just wanting to see that, especially in our lakeside areas, that council will be able to work with leasing land or working with Te Aroa and working with local iwi and hapu to provide open spaces on iwi land.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, that is a fact. We know that around a lot of our lakeside areas that we do have to share resources, and that's part of, I suppose, the partnerships that we have with various local land blocks and things like that. That sort of process would not be excluded by this, and we will check that, make sure that it's covered so that we can still develop those partnerships as we go, because we certainly know some of the development areas will be around lakes in the future, and we will need to manage that. In saying that, that might also provide the opportunity to get public land to carry on providing open space in those areas.
Thank you.
Mr. Berryman-Camp.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for the report. And look, great report, and certainly keen to support. Particularly pleased to see the inclusion of like 2.1.3, which was the cultural values component, working with tangata whenua. I guess my question builds on Mr. Thomas's, because I note in section 2.3.2, there's a discussion about working with providers like schools and marae, and it might be appropriate to enter into a community share partnership. My question is, what does a community share partnership actually look like? I'm mindful, you've got iwi-owned land, marae is privately owned land. What does a community share partnership actually look like? And is there a benefit for the parties that are sharing?
I guess in general, and it would be specific with that partner to negotiate the terms of what that would look like, but generally a community share partnership is where council is providing access to open space or a facility, so a playground, for example, on private land. So generally how that work is that council would own and be responsible for the maintenance of that piece of land or that playground or whatever that might be, in return for the community having access to that space.
If I could give an example, I mean, to me, an example of a community share partnership would be Emery Park at Gisborne Point, Lake Rotorua. Emery Park is a private piece of trust land. It's trust land. We have a playground on there that we've provided, and we do quite a bit of groundwork there as well with the trustees in terms of managing that, helping with their football fields and things like that, rugby fields. And so, there's a partnership that we have there in terms of being able to provide the community to have access to open space on non-council land.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So just in terms of supplemental, so as an example, does that mean something like the Marakai at Apamoana Marae, if those trustees decide to open that into a community garden, potentially they could enter into a partnership with RLC on the upkeep of that? Is that the sort of thing this would cover off?
Those sorts of partnerships are. We're open to those sorts of partnerships all the time. So we'd be certainly happy to talk to groups about that and whether there's benefits to both parties around that. So, yep.
Councillor Kumar.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you very much, Rob, as well. My question centres around some of the open spaces. I know we're going to consult with the LTP as well, but while I see a lot of other recreational activities included in there, like cycling, walking, and other paths that have been created, I'm just wanting to know, for our very small fraternity, the skating fraternity, what does this next lot of open space planning have in store for them?
I mean, we currently I mean, the skating community or small wheel community, whatever you want. I mean, we've got a lot of corridors and things like that that are available for them, and we have got in the LTP a process to look at the skate park development. And you know, as we know, Sheaf Park is currently well past renewal date, and we are looking at Kūrau Park and preparing a site there for the skating community. So that would be, you know, Kūrau Park is a premier park. It's a destination park, and again, that sort of facility would fit that sort of premier park category in the open space policy. So that would be the alignment that we could see for them.
Through the chair again, thank you, Rob, for telling me that there is an alignment and there's something in the LTP. But if I was to tell the skating fraternity that we have an open space plan, but what is the time frame? What do I tell them? Please.
It's outside of this policy. That's Quito Park development, and we've been briefed on that. This is an open space. It's about our reserves. I take your point for using the opportunity, but this is outside of that. But I suppose if people wanted to develop more concrete areas on their reserves, that's part of this policy.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So I think that we're talking here about an open spaces policy which is going out for consultation, Councillor Kumar, so perhaps that's a matter that we could discuss at an LTP forum on another occasion. Are these comments or questions relating to the point of order, or you? Sorry, well, I'll go back to the list of questions here then. So, Mayor Chadwick, I had you next on the list.
Thank you. And I think it's great. We need this really. It used to be a bit random and ad hoc, and while we're facing growth, I think the links with the spatial plan and then the place-based development that we're doing need to really come forward. And yes, we agree to this and it goes out to consultation, but at the same time we're asking the East Side community, what do you want? We're asking Nongataha, what do you want? We're going to areas to involve them in this, but we're doing it separate to that community consultation. I sort of think it's a bit of a pity this wasn't part of it, because you're getting people turning up, and I think that's great. But to get the open spaces policy in their mind that it's just not a green space, it's about connected to their footpaths and their streets and their bus stops and and it's more than just a green space. So the point of Mr. Berryman Camp about a community garden, if a community's interested in running that garden, those discussions are the richness that come out of this. And we've already gone out to consult on some of our Nongataha and East Side. We're consulting at the moment. Do we go back with this again? Because I think that's a missed opportunity.
Through you, Madam Chair, the proposed policy was actually, the framework for it was actually used to inform the open space provision in the East Side Wellness Structure Plan, including the connectivity between those spaces, the cycling walking links and the stormwater provision. In terms of activity on open spaces, the policy isn't intended to deal with that. It's intended to be reasonably high level in terms of the type and location and size of some of our open spaces. What can happen on specific reserves would be provided for in Council's reserve management plans, which is a requirement for us. We need to have reserve management plans for all our reserves under the Reserves Act. And really that's the tool for us to have specific conversations with our communities about what types of activities they want to see happen on specific reserves. So the intent would be that once we've got this policy, we would start reviewing some of our reserve management plans, which are reasonably out of date now.
Comment that I attended the Gifted Reserves meeting yesterday, and this policy was presented and well received.
Thank you for that. Mrs. Trumper?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Steph, I just had one question around accessibility, and the focus is basically on 500 metres. Is there going to be an extension or, a provision that you're actually going to be catering for those with mobility issues, to be able to use these open spaces and provision of equipment for them? And I know that the lakefront is a prime example that we are, going to be state of the art to come. I just wondered whether there would be, some of these reserves set aside for where they can access them as well.
Thank you, through you, Madam Chair. And apologies, Shirley, I should have been a little bit clearer in terms of what those accessibility level of service provisions are intended to do, because while it is also about, that 500 metre requirement, the policy deals with accessibility in all forms, including ensuring that people with lower mobility are able to access our reserves. So that's part of the assessment process that we would go through to make sure that they are accessible. That's where having things that are flat and good road frontage are really important for those types of things.
Councillor Tapsell.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and tēnā kōrua. My question this morning is really around the greenfields development. So Rotorua, like many cities in New Zealand, is in desperate need of new development and new homes. But as you rightly pointed out, some of the previous development has not allowed for practical parks that are safe and that are actually out in the open. So as we continue to grow and see new housing developments, is it clear to the developers what the council requirements or standards for parks are? I just thought I'd check because I couldn't see that clearly in there, and I ask that because we see that in a situation on private land that's developed, and they might put a park in which then later would be gifted to council, as you suggested, to be maintained, but just ensuring that those parks and reserves will be up to the standard that we would expect for our community and council. And then just the second question is...
Perhaps Councillor Tapsell, if we let them answer that question.
So currently we don't have anything to inform developers about what we would expect in terms of open space, but this policy is intended to do exactly that. Also making it easier for developers, so when they're starting their planning process, they know what the expectation is instead of coming into council and having to have that conversation down the track. But it also gives us a little bit more teeth to ensure that we are getting good quality open space and not essentially the land that they can't put houses on.
And your second question, Councillor Tapsell?
Thank you. And the second question was just around youth engagement. Now, we, I think, just over 10 years ago, had a wonderful youth group called E Oho from Kotu come in here and passionately submit and share their concerns about the low socioeconomic areas not having adequate parks and reserves. Consequently, council then funded $600,000 for parks and reserves, which is why Western Heights and Kotu now have great parks and reserves. So that was a great example of the ability of young people to actually tell us what they want. So just reassurance on when we go out for consultation, and I do absolutely support this, that we will ensure that we consult with our young people.
Yes, I can assure you we will do our very best to make sure that they have a voice in this process.
Thank you. Councillor Wayne.
Kia ora, Madam Chair, thank you. I'd just like to signal that I'd like to move the recommendation. And thank you, Steve and Rob. I think it's incredibly important. Open spaces reserves are incredibly important for thriving communities and for our families, for our children, for our youth, and their development. And thank you again to Councillor Tapsell for mentioning about the youth development. I think that's also incredibly important because those will be primarily the people that will be using these facilities. Could you explain what happens with those hard to access or not very practical areas? What could be done to unlock the potential of the land? Do you have a proposal of what you normally do with those hard to access areas?
It's a tricky question to answer. I guess we haven't done anything with them yet. The intent would be to develop our open space network plan, which would identify reserves that don't align with the policy, and first and foremost look for opportunities to improve them, to ensure there is alignment, in cases that might not be achievable though. So I guess at that point we would potentially look first and foremost to see what other areas of council might need that for, so, and I guess that reflects that multiple functions of reserves being for stormwater, etc. And I guess as a last resort we might look to divest that piece of land.
Mr. Thomas?
Thank you, Madam Mayor, and I'm sorry I forgot to ask my follow-on questions when I asked previously. One was, and they both come out of the attachments you provided in the agenda. One is around land use types and consideration in areas of focus. And I just note where you have mentioned rural residential, and you're talking about the larger property sizes, and that is true for a lot of our rural residential. But I think it's really important to remember that we have a large number of rural residential properties which are no larger or often smaller than a normal urban section. And once again, I'm talking about our lakeside communities especially. So not all those rural residential areas do have access to larger sections themselves. So I think it's important to remember them. And my second question was around the connections policy. Where you're talking, you mainly the examples were sort of urban connections between open spaces. Will you be looking at, putting into the policy connections from sort of distant places as well? And a prime example of a connection we have in our lakeside areas is we're about to get a connection between Moria and O'Kerry Falls, but we would love to be seeing a connection between Moria and Okawa Bay and Rotorua City. So those connections are important, and I think without a policy around those in place, it's very hard to get those issues debated or sort of work towards getting something in place there.
Through you, Madam Chair, the 2 points to that was around the larger section or rural sort of areas or lakeside areas. I mean, one of the things that the open space policy does take into account that there may be other opportunities for recreation rather than just a public open space. If we've got a subdivision right next to a forest, or if we've got areas next to lakes, and so we do need to factor that in. But yes, we will try and we will apply the policy to those rural areas, but there will be slightly different criteria than there would be for other urban areas. Your second point about connections in rural or lakeside areas as well, how are they incorporated? This policy recognises that it's got to be used as a component with integration with other council activities, and certainly in a lot of those areas, that's where we probably have with this policy, we have a good tool to work with our other sections and say, hey, look, it's important with infrastructure and things like this, that as these are developed, that we recognise the needs for some of these, and how do we incorporate that into a larger, bigger picture design. So it's got the tools to get in there, and it's that integration across council.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Councillor Bentley.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I don't have a question. I'd just like to second the motion.
Thank you, Councillor Bentley. Mayor Chadwick.
Yes, look, I'll challenge the youth here that several older people use these spaces. Endless swings and sitting for hours in these spaces, which I really enjoy. And it's a community bumping space. So I would love to see older people, grey power, age concern and others being asked. They were very interested in the inner city development. They were interested in Quedo Park. I think they need to look at the open spaces policy. And I think it's a bit flat just calling it an open spaces policy. It has endless potential. And Linmore Play Centre, for example, wanted to use a locked green space, which was locked, you know, and fenced all the way around, so that their children could spill over and play in there. And they had to consult household by household for approval for their kids to be able to play in that space. So I think we need to think a bit differently about the use of these places. If there's a kohanga reo, a school, a kindergarten, a play centre, they are very, very interested in these places because they'll either walk to them or a walking bus down to them to enjoy them. Because now when you look at childcare centres, they're tiny. They're absolutely tiny and they don't have much green space at all. So I'd love to see that as being part of Activated when we take this out. They've got some cool ideas for use, but yeah, just some other thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Are there no other questions there? I'm sure that the public will be really interested in this policy when it goes out for public consultation. I've already had it moved by Councillor Wang and seconded by Councillor Bentley. If there are no other questions or discussions, I'm now going to put that motion that the committee recommends to the Council that the proposed draft open space level of service policy be adopted for public consultation pursuant to Section 82 of the Local Government Act. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. Thank you. Okay, we're now going to move into the public excluded session. Sorry, Mr. Bury.
No, thank you, Madam Chair. Look, I do apologise. Sorry, I'm just checking and I'll take the guidance of council staff here. I realised that I had incorrectly voted in the Class 4 gambling vote. Am I able to change that?
We didn't do a division and individual votes were not recorded on that, Mr. Berryman Kemp, so I think that...
Oh, I will take your guidance. It's just that I realised that I was thinking of something else.
If you would prefer that we note that you didn't take part in the voting, is that what you're asking us to do?
No, sorry, what it was when we went to the vote, I went yes. What I should have done is went no. I fully accept that I did that. I was just wanting to check to see if that's possible to be changed. But I take your steer.
I'm being told, advised here that it is possible to show your vote as a no if that is what you now wish.
If that's okay, yes, I would please.
Okay, thank you. That'll be then noted.
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to move into the public excluded session. There are two items for consideration. There's the approval of the confidential minutes and the economic recovery project. The reasons for public exclusion are commercial sensitivity and to enable commercial or industrial negotiations. So can I ask for a mover and a seconder that we move into the public excluded session? Thank you, Councillor McPherson. Seconded, Councillor Tapsell. All those in favour, please say aye. Against, carried. And just wait for the public